Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on measuring portfolio alignment, climate scenarios, and climate stress testing. So for everyone's information, this is the first training of the JUST series. For the year 2022, GC3SC4 has planned out and we will be hosting a series of webinars under different themes, starting with incorporating ESG into risk management. So aside from today's and tomorrow's webinar, there will be another training session on the 19th of January, focusing on the implementation and application of CCPT. So if you are interested and would like to participate, please feel free to register. We'll be dropping the registration link in the chat box below. So before we begin, I would like to remind everyone on a few house rules. Firstly, throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. The speakers will attend to the questions as we go along. There is also a dedicated Q&A session at the very end where speakers will be answering your questions live. Please also take note that today's and tomorrow's session will be recorded and the recordings will be made available later on the GCP platform. Without further ado, to kick off our two-day training session, I would like to invite Raja Amir Shah, the CEO of HSBC Amanah, as the chairman of GC3SC4 to give his opening remarks. So Ajay, please turn on your camera and unmute your mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatin. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all the participants of today's JUST series training session. First and foremost, I would like to thank you all for taking time to attend today's training session. Amidst this still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the threat of climate change and the associated economic impacts that climate change pose remains imminent. Therefore, continuous actions from various stakeholders are essential, as failure to take into consideration the dynamic impact of climate change would be detrimental to the planet, people, and prosperity of the economy. In Malaysia, we have begun to make strides within this space, particularly for the financial industry. Recognizing the urgent need for collaboration in accelerating responses towards addressing climate change, the Joint Committee on Climate Change, also known as JC3, which is led by Bank Negara Malaysia together with Securities Commission of Malaysia, which established since 2019, continues to actively focus on transitioning the Malaysian financial sector towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. As one of the subcommittees under JC3, Subcommittee 4, Engagement and Capacity Building, we are mandated to build and strengthen the awareness of climate change and measures to ensure economic resilience through engagement and capacity development initiatives. This will be done through knowledge sharing of expertise and best practices in assessing and managing climate-related risks, not only within the financial industry, but also with our wider stakeholder group. The committee, as mentioned by Fatin, is chaired by myself and assisted by my deputy chair, Mr. Sharil Azwar Jimin, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Maybank Group. It is also our intention to leverage external industry influence and engagement as an enabler to achieve a collaborative network of stakeholders in an ecosystem to fight against climate change. Subsequent to the foundation level programs which were conducted by the JC3 Subcommittee 4 in 2020 and 2021, the training calendar this year is centered around the following 4 themes and will be more specialized in nature and tailored for financial institutions, other relevant institutions, including corporates. The themes are as follows: incorporating ESG into risk management, governance and reporting, financial solutions, social sustainability towards a just transition. For today's training session, which is part of the theme under incorporating ESG into risk management, I hope that the participants will be able to gain knowledge and insights on the overview and importance of climate scenario analysis and stress testing in practice from the experts who have in the field who have kindly joined us for today's training, as well as the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment Tool, shortly known as Pacta, a climate portfolio alignment tool, and as well as its application. Pacta has indeed become an important tool in supporting our ambitions to prioritize financing and investments that supports the transition to a net zero global economy. As part of HSBC Group, in this regard, we aim to align our financed emissions, the carbon emissions of our portfolio of customers, to the Paris Agreement goal to achieve net zero by 2050 or sooner, and use the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment tool to develop clear, measurable pathways to net zero. As the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in his COP26 remarks, the drive to net zero must be the new normal for everyone, everywhere, for every country, company, city, and financial institution. For your information, this training session is a result of a current ongoing project where WWF Malaysia and 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, 2DI, are currently collaborating with major banks in Malaysia to measure the alignment of their financial portfolio with climate scenarios using the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment Pacta tool. Therefore, I would like to extend our deepest appreciation to the UK Pact, Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions, a program funded by the UK government, which has been supporting this and other joint initiatives. I hope participants will be able to internalize this training session and be able to translate that meaningful key actions to be developed in your respective institutions. I also look forward to your continued cooperation this year for our JUST series. Thank you, and I will now hand the floor back to Fatin from WWF.
Thank you, Encik Raja Amir Shah, for the opening speech and for giving us a strong start of the day. So WWF and 2 Degree Investing Initiative, 2DI for short, have been partnering on different ends through our international offices, supporting both global and different countries' climate aspirations. With growing awareness in the local financial sector, WWF Malaysia and 2DI have collaborated to introduce Pacta to the banks in Malaysia. So this exercise, which is among the first in the country, is enabled by UK Pact. Now, with the release of the exposure draft by Bank Negara Malaysia on climate risk management and scenario analysis in December last year, today's workshop proves to be very timely and hopefully will be beneficial and informational for everyone. So without further ado, I would like to invite the experts in the field, Martin, who is the head of Pacta, and George, the product lead of Pacta at 2DI. So speakers, please turn on your camera and unmute your microphone. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Fatin, for the introductions, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. Before we kick off, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the JC3 for organizing this event and also to the MSFI for supporting as well. So today we'll firstly be hearing from Martin Felschauer, who is the head of Pacta, who will be setting the scene, discussing a bit of the reasons as to why climate scenario analysis is so important, also introducing the idea of stress testing. We'll then hear back from me on the Pacta methodology, and then we will go into practically how you can be implementing these methodologies at your own institutions. Before we will move on to the stress testing part, my colleague Jacob will be taking this, and then we will move on to hear from Alberto Gervasini from ING, who is the lead of the terror report. So real thought leaders in the space on measuring scenario analysis as well. So we really look forward to hearing from him later today. So with that, I'll hand over to Martin Felschauer to introduce Pacta, climate scenario analysis and stress testing. Thank you, Martin.
Great, thanks a lot, George, and thanks to everyone for being here. Indeed, I'd like to join George in thanking UK Pact as a funder, JC3, MSFI, but also, of course, our partner WWF in this project. As George said, my name is Martin Felschauer. I'm the head of Pacta at 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, and I've been with 2 Degrees for about a year and a half. And before that, I was actually at the European Commission at the Sustainable Finance department there. And I've been in the Brussels bubble for about, I guess, 3-4 years now. And I think that in Europe, we like to think of ourselves as a leader on sustainable finance, or at least maybe a front runner. And with everything that's going on the taxonomy, which will be, I'm sure you guys will also be following with great interest. But also, if I'm seeing right now that we have more than 600 participants on this webinar, it makes me wonder whether actually the baton of leadership on sustainable finance is not moving away from Europe, but actually moving in the direction of Asia, because I do not recall in the past 2-3 years a webinar in Europe that was this popular and this exciting. So I think that's really really impressive, and congratulations to all of you. It's really great to see this topic really being taken up throughout the globe. So yeah, big thanks from the Brussels bubble. Before passing it back to George, I just wanted to set kind of the context for climate scenario analysis. So I think if we go to the next slide, George, I think it's important to realize that this webinar would not take place without the existence of the idea of scenario analysis. If it wasn't for climate scientists working very hard to try and assess, to try and not predict or forecast, maybe not the right word, but to try and see what different possible future pathways there are on climate, to actually show us the gravity of the situation, to show us what would happen in a 2, 3, 4, 5 degree world, what would happen to coastal lines, et cetera, et cetera. It's because of scenario analysis that we are even here today. It's because of scenario analysis that we are able to understand what could happen to us from a climate perspective. The difficulty, of course, is that we are already feeling the effects of climate change today, but the most severe and the most wide-ranging consequences, both in terms of the transition and physical risk, lie in the future, lie still in the medium term. And that means that you need scenarios to try and assess what could happen and how could that affect you. And so what you see as a kind of very first primer is that climate change scenarios, they're not about predicting the future. It's just about projecting different pathways. And to do that, you need to estimate population levels, economic growth, changes in mobility, technological change, etc. And there's two main types of climate scenarios. There are those that articulate different policy outcomes and the energy and economic pathways that would result. And there are those who would kind of start with the atmospheric GHG concentrations and articulate kind of, if this is the GHG in the atmosphere, what would that look like in real life, in practice? And so the Ipcc scenarios are really the second type of scenarios. Those are the scenarios that show you the kind of concentration pathways out there on greenhouse gas emissions, whereas scenarios from for example, the International Energy Agency are really about the first. It's about different policy outcomes, driving different changes, and what does that do? And it's really leading us to transition scenarios. I also just want to end this slide on a quick note to say that, as I said, we wouldn't be here without scenario analysis, but scenario analysis is also actually already quite old. Royal Dutch Shell was one of the first to apply scenario analysis, and they applied it in relation, they actually tried to predict the oil crisis in the 70s. They tried to predict what would happen if the oil producing countries raised or lowered the production and raised prices. And that's actually what allowed them to weather that storm rather well. If we move to the next slide, I think what we have seen in the past few years is that the importance of scenario analysis and the importance of measuring portfolio alignment has really increased over the past 3-4 years. Of course, a fundamental piece of work in the sustainable finance community is the TCFD and their disclosure guidelines. They were published in 2017, the first round, and a big element of what they are suggesting is the use of scenario analysis. And they're effectively saying that, given the importance of forward-looking assessments, given the uncertainty that we have on what will happen, scenario analysis is an important and useful tool to assess the business implications of climate-related risks and opportunities. And so already in 2017, there's this big call, I think, to the financial sector to start with scenario analysis. We also, if we go to the next slide, see this in the supervisory community. So the Network for Greening the Financial System published in 2020 a guide for central banks and supervisors as to how they could use scenario analysis, with the explicit understanding that because of the forward-looking nature of climate risk and the inherent uncertainty, scenario analysis offers a methodological framework that allows you to explore what could happen and prepare yourself for that as well. And then I think over the last year, the attention has really increased even more, and with a specific focus also on portfolio alignment. If we move to the next slide, we will have seen that the portfolio alignment team published a paper earlier last year, in the middle of last year, urging financial institutions to measure and disclose their alignment with the Paris Agreement, for which you need Paris-aligned scenarios, 1.5-degree scenarios. And what is clear in their recommendations is not only that people use them, but that you should translate scenarios, you should translate the carbon budgets into a benchmark for which you want to assess your performance. You assess the performance of the companies against those scenarios, and then you aggregate the company scores up to come to some sort of overall score for your portfolio or the sector that you are financing. And now, of course, we have the wonderful acronym of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, and membership of this alliance through the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Net Zero Banking Alliance is skyrocketing. And what you see here as well is that these are financial institutions that have committed to reduce emissions by 2050, reduce emissions by 2030. And for that, you need science-based guidelines, you need scenarios, you need strategies. And so what we can see is that over the past few years, I think the scenario analysis has always been with us. It's been with us in Shell. It's why we are here today. But the importance of scenario analysis and portfolio alignment in the financial sector in relation to climate is really ballooning. And I think for the better, because it's a very important tool for financial institutions to try and assess what the future may hold and how well they're doing in reaching one or the other future. So with that, I'll pass it back to George and the team, who will take a deeper look into the Pacta approach.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Martin, for that comprehensive introduction to the space. And if I can get the next slide to work. Here we go. I will dive a bit deeper into the Pacta methodology itself. So Pacta, the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment. First and foremostly, this is a free and open source climate scenario tool. So it's a methodology, and we also provide a supporting toolkit. It's free to all users, and indeed it's open source. So what this means is that after this presentation, any financial institutions from the banking side, but also from the investor side, can go and implement this on their own systems and run this analysis through their own portfolios at no cost to the user. So Pacta measures the alignment of financial portfolios. Again, this is split into 3 asset classes at the moment. The first is the corporate lending side, which I'll be discussing a bit later. And then also on the equity side and corporate bond side. And again, my colleague Naira will be diving a bit deeper into that later. Pacta covers a few key climate relevant sectors. Again, we'll go through those. And it's forward looking. So it's quite unique in the market in that it's forward looking up to 5 years in the future. And it's based on this bottom up approach. We do this by evaluating the capital stock and the expenditure plans of the corporates or the companies that you as a financial institution are financing. And then finally, Pacta, as Martin discusses, is in itself a portfolio alignment tool, so measuring alignment to climate change scenarios. But off of the back of this, we can use it for several different use cases. So Pacta can be used to inform your risk management, which is what we'll be discussing today. We'll also be publishing a white paper off the back of some work we've been doing with a group of banks in Malaysia at the beginning of February. And this will focus on the risk management side of things, but it can also be used for target setting. And again, we'll have a use case from ING later today, who will touch on this a bit and how they use it. It can be used for strategic decision-making, can be used with engaging with clients. Again, I think this is a use case that ING have used. And finally, it can be used in reporting and disclosure. So as Martin mentioned earlier, the TCFD guidelines really stress this use case of reporting and disclosure as well. So the methodology, how does all this work? First thing that we do is we have on the right-hand side of your screen, we have physical assets in the real economy. So across the following sectors, the oil and gas sector, where we're looking at extraction of oil and gas, coal, where we're looking at coal mining, the automotive sector, the manufacture of cars themselves, the power sector, where it's looking at power generation, steel, cement, again, manufacturing of steel and cement, and the aviation sector. We have a data set, a database of all of those individual assets globally. These assets, we know the production forecasts based on the evolution of capital stock and capital expenditure as to how the technologies will be evolving in the next 5 years and the production coming from the respective technologies. What we then do is we map those assets to the companies that own them. So we map up the corporate ownership structure so that we get to the companies and their respective production plans. What we then do is we tie these through the securities that they offer or through the lending activities that a bank has to the financial portfolio. Again, this can be loan books or this can be investment portfolios. The way in which we do that differs slightly, and we'll mention that a bit later. What we then have is, the next slide will come up, is we can compare these to these different climate change scenarios. So as Martin mentioned, there are kind of two broad types of climate change scenarios. We have those from the Ipcc, which is looking at the different temperatures, different representative concentration pathways. It's actually what you see on the screen here. And then we have the translation of those into sectoral decarbonization pathways, or we can think of these as technology roadmaps. These are the sort of ones that you get from the International Energy Agency, also the Joint Research Centre out of the European Commission. And we also have some from the Net Zero the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. So these scenarios tell us how the world could proceed so as to achieve different climate change goals, be it better than 2 degrees, net zero, 1.5, but also how it is going as the business as usual. So we have different potential outcomes, and these are translated into production values of different technologies. In really high level terms, we know that we need to decrease coal-fired power generation at a production trend, and we need to increase renewable energy capacity at a production trend. So you can begin to get a picture of how we're tying the real economy, those physical assets on the right-hand side, to the financial institutions financing them, and then comparing that to the required production trends. How do we then show this alignment? We use a set of metrics. So the first one is a technology mix. The second one is then for each individual technology, we give a production trend and how that weighs up against the different scenarios. And then finally, we have an emission intensity metric. The use for this is slightly different, and I'll explain that in the coming slides. So with that, if we go back, I'll just mention the different sectors. So these are what we define as the key climate relevant sectors. So these are the main drivers of climate change and the sectors that we have these technology roadmaps for. Noticeable exceptions here would be agriculture and real estate, which of course are big drivers of climate change in themselves. And we're currently investigating including those, but as of today, they remain out of scope. So for the oil and gas and coal sector, we're looking at the upstream element. So physically getting these resources out of the ground. In the power sector, we're focusing on the power generation element of it. And then for automotive, it's the manufacture of the cars. For steel and cement, it's the manufacture of the raw materials themselves. And aviation has recently been added. And here we're looking at the airliners. So AirAsia, Malaysian Airlines, British Airways, this is the segment that we're looking at. Shipping is currently under development, and we hope to have that ready this year. So why do we look at these segments? As we mentioned, these are the most climate relevant segments of the value chain. There is an assumption here that if steering efforts, if how we steer our capital is made within this part of the value chain, the rest of the value chain will fall in line. This doesn't mean to say that you might not have risk associated with exposures further down the value chain. Of course, this is still possible, but for now, the focus is on this kind of climate relevance segment. Also, this is where we have the production values. This is what we can compare directly to those climate change scenarios that we mentioned before. So we then have two different groups, if you will. We have sectors where we know these technology roadmaps. This is the fossil fuel sector, the power sector, and the automotive sector. These are where we have mature technologies, mature low carbon technologies, which we know we can transition into. For example, automotive, we can go from internal combustion engines into electric vehicles. In the power sector, from fossil fuel power generation into renewables, hydro, and the such. And in oil and gas and coal, we know we need to decrease our production from these. This is not quite yet the case when it comes to the remaining sectors. So for steel and cement and aviation, as it goes, we don't have such well-defined technology roadmaps, which means that we can't say which technology we need to translate into. Although efforts are being made to get to these, we're currently not there. In this case, we use an emission intensity metric. So emission intensity is kind of technology agnostic in that you can compare between different technologies based around an emission intensity. So for the former, we use the technology/fuel mix and individual production volume trajectories. And then for the latter, where we don't have the roadmaps, we use this emission intensity metric. So what do all of these metrics show us and what do they mean? Firstly, we'll look at the technology mix. So for the sector, in this case, the power sector, we have a series of different technology exposures based on our portfolios. So the first column that we show is our current exposure today. So across all these technologies, you see the green is renewables and the dark gray color at the bottom is coal, and then technologies in between. We know our financial exposure to these different technologies within our power portfolios. We then benchmark this to the market. The market can be defined differently. In the case of investors, we take this as an index. And then in the case of banks for corporate lending, we take this as the corporate economy. So all of the corporates acting in the real economy, we sum their production. That's how we define the market. So from 1 to 2, we can compare our exposure to the markets. And in this case, it's about the same as the high carbon, the coal, but it's less exposed to the lower carbon technologies, most notably renewables at the top. We then fast this forward 5 years to column 3 to see what the portfolio projection looks like. This is purely based on the underlying companies that we finance and how their technology mix is evolving. This is not based on how your exposures will change in the next 5 years. It's based on how the companies are evolving. So with no reallocation or no action from the portfolio manager, the companies will change their technology mix. And that's what's shown in column 3. So we can see that the renewables is increasing, and actually it looks like the coal has increased slightly as well. Then we look at column 4, which is looking at what the portfolio would need to look like in terms of financial exposure to be aligned with a sustainable development scenario. This is a Paris-aligned scenario. This could be a net zero scenario. It's just illustrative here. So in this case, the portfolio is increasing its renewable exposure, however, not at the rates required to be aligned with a Paris-aligned pathway. We also show the same for the market, which is number 5. And you see that the market itself has to do even more. So we can start to think about how we can infer market risk, so our exposure against the market, and then also climate transition risk. So throughout Pacta, we're always making those 2 benchmark comparisons. Comparison against the scenario, and then comparison against the market as well. So that's our first set of metric. And then our second one is we're now going to hone in to the individual technologies. And here we look at the volume production trajectory that we are financing. So in this graph that we have, the different colors on the back of, so from the red through to the green, represent different scenarios, potential pathways that the world may follow. In the red, this is a current policy scenario. You can think of this as business as usual. And this roughly equates to more than 3.2 degrees of global warming. We then move to the yellow scenarios in the middle. These are new policy or stated policy scenarios. And these scenarios are what policymakers have announced. So the key example here would be the nationally determined contributions of individual companies are factored into the yellow scenarios. So what's been announced but hasn't yet happened. And in this case, it ranges between 2 to 3.2 degrees Celsius. And then we get to the green ones at the bottom, which is where we need to be deemed aligned with the Paris Agreement. And again, we can do this for net zero as well. So better than 2 degrees, ideally 1.5, and even better, net zero by 2050. So these are for each individual technology. In the case we're looking at here, it is the gas power capacity of the portfolio. So the solid red line is then showing us how our production that we finance is increasing in the next 5 years. Here we show from 2018 to 2023, but of course we will now be 2022 up to 2027. So the solid red line is the production values that we're financing. And what this means is that the companies that we have exposures to are, in this case, adding additional gas power capacity. So they're adding capacity to the grid, and that's increasing at a rate of change consistent with this red scenario, dipping into the yellow towards the end. But we can infer that this means we're on a trajectory to align with 3.2 degrees. Then the dotted line is this market benchmark. So again, this can be an index when we're looking at the investor side, and it can be the corporate economy, the sum of all the corporates in the world, in the case of corporate lending. Here, the market is actually aligning with the 2 degrees world. So it's in the green by the end point of the analysis. So we can infer that this portfolio, the solid line, is performing worse in terms of climate alignment than the scenarios and also the market. One important point to note here as well on the scenarios and indeed on the market benchmark is we can break this down regionally. So this isn't always global. We can break this down depending on the scenarios by individual regions. In the work we've been doing with some of the Malaysian banks, we've been using a Southeast Asia benchmark. So the requirement from these scenarios for Southeast Asia might be different than they are for Europe and North America, and indeed globally. So I think it's an important point to note that we can regionally contextualize how our alignment needs to look and indeed infer regional risk from this. To give another example of that, there's no nuclear in the Southeast Asia region, whereas there is in the North America region. What this means is the climate modelers have required that nuclear evolves in a different way in Europe and in North America, but we're not suggesting that banks and financial institutions in your region would have to do the same. You have your own set of benchmarks, your own set of feasible targets to make. Again, these are broken down by the climate scientists within those climate change models. And if you join the webinar tomorrow, we'll be presenting some results and going into that in a bit more detail as well. So then back to the final set of metrics here is our emission intensity ones. So as a reminder, we apply emission intensity metrics when we don't have these these technology roadmaps. So in this case, it's for cement. This would also be true for aviation and for steel. So what we have here is the portfolio itself is the top line, so the darker of the blue. And we know what its emission intensity based off a bottom-up technology-based data set of each of the individual cement or steel plants that we finance. We then convert those to emission intensities using emission factor models. So we convert X amount of production from this technology equates to this CO2 intensity. That's a quick introduction to how we do this. And you will see the portfolio is 0.65 roughly. And then the corporate economy, so this light blue, this kind of teal color, if you will, is about 0.3 CO2. Again, the key metric here is CO2 per ton of cement or per ton of steel. Then we have the trajectory as to how they are progressing over the next 5 years. In this case, it's flat. And then these colored lines, so the purple one is what the target for the portfolio has to be based on a scenario. And the yellow line is what it would have to be for the corporate economy. This is just illustrative as well, so I wouldn't think too much about the absolute values here. So how do we do this? What's the methodology? We use the sectoral decarbonization approach, which is a methodology created by the Science Based Targets Initiative. What this means is that the alignment targets, will converge at the end point of the scenario. So that means that your portfolio must equal the corporate economy's portfolio target at the end of the scenario. This might be up to 2050. Okay, so that was a quick rundown of the different metrics and a high level of the methodology. So what does this all tell us? What are the kind of key questions that have been addressed with Pacta? So the first thing is, what is the portfolio exposed to in terms of its climate relevant sectors? Does it have this exposure? We can screen this. The next thing is then, what are the production and investment plans of those individual companies, and how are they aligned to these different technology roadmaps? From this, we can imply an implied temperature range that our investments will be aligned with or associated with. And then we can dive into which of the individual companies are driving these results. We can then start to think about how we can action this with engagement or even reallocation, but for now, we'll just leave it at that. And then finally, how do we as a portfolio compare to market benchmarks? And again, these market benchmarks can be broken down regionally as well. So with that, I'll quickly introduce the next section. So as I say, we have two broad versions of Pacta. We have Pacta for banks, where we're focusing on the corporate lending side of things. And then we have Pacta for investors, where we're focusing on equities, funds, and corporate bonds as well. And for the next section, we will be going through how you as financial institutions can perform this analysis yourself. So with that, I will hand over to Naira, who is our head of Pacta for investors at 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. And she will introduce this from the investor side and also some extra elements that you get with the investors. Thanks, and over to you, Naira.
Thanks, George. So hello, everyone. My name is Naira Herrera. I'm the product lead of Pacta for Investors, as George just mentioned. Today I'm going to introduce the Pacta for Investors tool and briefly explain the process to generate the interactive reports, which you will see it's very easy. So Pacta for Investors measures the alignment of listed equity, corporate bonds, and portfolio funds. Our tool has been used by more than 3,000 financial institutions. We have users from more than 90 countries all around the world, and our platform analyzes more than 600 portfolios per month. The tool is available online on the Transition Monitor platform, where any user can generate in less than 30 minutes the interactive report of their portfolio alignment to climate change scenarios. The process is very simple. The user just need to go to the Transition Monitor platform, register, and create an account. After having the account, the user can upload as many portfolios as he wants and generate a report per portfolio, and also even group the portfolios according to the user's convenience. The portfolio data must be in a very simple 5-column structure. In the first column, the user will indicate the name of the investor of the financial institution who is running the analysis. In the second one is the name of the portfolio. In the third column is the asset with which we can identify the assets that are part of this portfolio. In the fourth column, the market value. And in the fifth column, the currency in which the investment is made. After uploading the portfolio to the platform, the user will have access to the audit file, which contains the list of securities that were included in the analysis. Of course, these securities are those that are part of the sectors and the value chains analyzed by Pacta. And the result is an interactive report where the user can see and analyze the portfolio per technology, per type of assets. This allows the users to better understand their exposure to transition risk per sector. The user can customize each chart with different options that are provided in the tool. So it's possible to choose different scenarios to compare to, also different benchmarks to compare your portfolio, as the Standard & Poor's 500, the MSCI World, the MSCI Emerging Markets. You will also able to include as many charts as you want, download the report as a PDF format, or also share the interactive report without sharing the details of your portfolio. So remember, you can access the platform in the website transitionmonitor.com. If you go to the next slide, please, George. In addition to the volume trajectory metric, the tech mix, and the emission intensity charts that George just explained, the Pacta for Investors report has a section that presents the financial exposure of the portfolio to climate relevant sectors. This is the one you're seeing on the left side on the screen. This shows which proportion of the portfolio is invested in each one of the Pacta sectors. Basically, it allows the user to be aware of the impact that each sector can have in the portfolio. We also have a section where we provide company level information in the interactive report. These are the charts that you can see on the right side of the slide. In these two charts, we have these two charts in this moment for the automotive and power sector, but we are evaluating how we can also expand this information to other sectors. In the bubble chart that you can see in the upper right side, it shows in the x-axis the share of the production of the companies in low carbon technologies. So the companies that are further to the right have more share of low carbon technologies today. And in the y-axis, we can see the required build out to be aligned with the B2DS scenario. So the upper the companies are in this chart, the more ambitious these companies are regarding their investment plans in low carbon technologies. The size of the bubble represents the weight of that specific company in the portfolio. Therefore, the biggest the bubble, the highest the impact that the company will have in the results. And the bubbles or the companies with the best climate performance will be located in the upper right quadrant. The chart at the bottom right shows the technology mix of the most important companies of the portfolio in the power and automotive sector as well. So if the portfolio contains equity of, for example, BMW or Toyota, you will be able to see the proportion of electric cars, hybrid cars, and internal combustion engine cars that are produced by those companies. Remember that you can download this data, the data we use to generate those charts in the options menu that is next to each one of the charts in our interactive report. If we go to our next slide, I will present to you the new transition disruption metric that was included in the Pacta report in December 8th. This is the first metric that seeks to capture mid-term disruption. It goes over the 5 years forecast of the Pacta analysis and fills the gap with other long-term projections that normally go until 2040 or 2050. The TDM metric is complementary to the Pacta model and provides a score of the potential medium-term disruption of the portfolio under the forecast policy scenario developed by IPR. The higher the score of the metric, the greater the risk the disruption will be. This metric is available at portfolio level and at a technology level as well. The score measures the progress of the portfolio compared with the IPR scenario. So it generates a score of the potential disruption that the portfolio can have by 2030 based on the extent to which the portfolio is behind or ahead of the FPS scenario in the first 5 years. In other words, it measures how much you have left to do relative to the time you have left. It is a very simple and intuitive score that it's easy to interpret. If the score is equal to 0, we can say that the portfolio has fully mitigated the FPS transition. If it is between 0 and 1, the portfolio is ahead of the FPS scenario. If it is equal to 1, it's just on track to meet the goals of the scenario by 2030. If the portfolio is between 1 and 0.5, we said that is a managed disruption, so has no fully mitigated the FPS transition, but is on the way and can be managed. When the score is over 1.5, we said that is an unmanaged or high disruption because the portfolio is behind the scenario. Maybe I will use an analogy to better explain the principle of this metric. So let's assume that you are in a competition and you have to run 10 kilometers in 1 hour. If you run the 10 kilometers in 30 minutes or less, your score will be 0 because you finish your task before the time you have planned to do it. If you run 8 kilometers in 30 minutes, your score will be between 0 and 1 because you are ahead in time to complete the race, but you still have 2 kilometers to go to finish. If you run 5K in 30 minutes, your score will be 1. You are on track to complete the 10K in the hour that you have planned to do it. But if you run only 2.5 in 30 minutes, then your score will be 1.5 because you are running too slow to complete the carrot in 1 hour. And it means that if you want to reach the goal by the hour, you need to accelerate your pace in the 30 minutes that you have left. and that's the TDM metric. I invite you to go to the platform, upload your portfolios, and if you have any comments or suggestions, don't hesitate to contact us. Thanks a lot. I give the word again to you, George.
Great, thank you very much, Naira. And to all those banks, I'm afraid that this new metric's not quite ready for banks yet, but we hope to be incorporating it soon as well. Great. So with that, I will explain how banks and the corporate lending side of things can also get their results. So it's slightly different. Firstly, we're looking at corporate lending portfolios, and the way in which we implement it is slightly different. So in the case of banks, we need to, so with the investors, it's okay for investors to upload kind of ISINs to a secure platform online and then get results automatically generated. However, due to data constraints and confidentiality of banks' clients, we couldn't work out a system whereby a bank could upload a loan book, as I'm sure you can all understand, to an online portal as such, which means that we've had to develop a desktop version of the software. And effectively, we have to give the banks all of the information. So this is the software itself and the data set so that they can implement it on their systems. So we've done this by creating a free desktop version of the software, which is coded in R. So if you're going to be implementing this, you need someone with some R skills. Don't need to be a software developer by any stretch of the imagination, just someone that has small amount of experience in software, in coding, essentially. You can implement this methodology. Methodology and supporting documentation is all online. We have a series of webinars and practical user guide materials so that you can follow step by step how to implement this. And then also I should mention the data set. So the data set is provided by a kind of sister organization called Asset Resolution. They in themselves are a commercial entity, so you can buy different data products from them. However, they commit to providing, at least at the moment, a free data set for banks to use. So you can request this from the Transition Monitor website. Again, we'll link that at the end of the slide deck. And they will send you the data for you to process the analysis on your side. So just briefly to mention that as well, even though there is this free asset resolution data set and there's this free open source software that you can use, you can of course do this however you wish. Pacta is a methodology. You can implement it with your own data. You can procure your own data from any data provider you wish, as long as it contains the same type of data points. So production values, bottom up from the asset level to the company level. And you can also use your own software. You can do this in Excel. You can do this in Python. You could have your own software development teams create an in-house system, which indeed some banks do. Or you can use the free data set and the free software that we provide. So just to mention that it is open like that, but we do try to make it as easy as possible for you to use. Then finally, this has been used by at least 70 banks who have requested this free data set. This is increasing daily. And then it was developed and road tested with 18 major international banks, to which you'll be hearing from ING, one of the key contributors, later today. And you can see some of the other big names on your screen at the moment. Great, so as I say, the software packages, it comes in 4 broad different packages. The first one is R2DII.data. So this is looking at mock data sets. Here are templates that you can use to prepare your loan book. The matching element is then the matching software. So matching those physical assets in the real economy to their companies, which is what we do, and then matching your loans to those companies. So I won't go into details of that now, but there is a webinar online, which you can follow the step-by-step guidance. Then it's the analysis, R2DI.analysis. That's running and crunching all the numbers. And then finally, it's R2DI.plot, which you see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, which is producing the visualizations of these results. Again, you can use these visualizations, or you can visualize these results however you wish yourself. Great. So everything we've been talking about so far is Pacta. So this is, again, this climate scenario analysis, but mainly it's this portfolio alignment, measuring the alignment of our exposures, the underlying assets to trends and required trends from these climate change scenarios. This can be used to kind of inform risk management at a qualitative level. So we're looking, if we're misaligned, this implies that we're exposed to transition risks. If there's a late and sudden transition, we're going to be exposed to this. Also, through the market benchmark, we can infer kind of market risk. If we're far behind the market when it comes to electric vehicle production, for example, we could infer that we're missing out on a market gain or there's an opportunity cost there. So this is on the qualitative level. And now we'd like to introduce the stress testing element. So this is, I won't go too much into it because my colleague on the line, Jacob, will go in more detail. But here we're starting to get more into the quantitative side of things. So we're trying to perform climate stress tests to understand kind of our losses at a more quantitative level. And with that, I will hand over to Jacob, who will take you through the methodology of the stress testing module. Thanks.
Thank you, George. So my name is Jakub Červenka. I am an analyst in the climate stress testing team, which is a fairly new team at 2DII. And my work in the stress testing team involves both modeling the actual stress test and outreach to our clients and counterparties that we do our research with. This project is, as I said, fairly new, but we've already included that within the Pacta for Investors interactive report. So investors wishing to stress test their market risk on their equity portfolio can already perform this analysis within the interactive report, which is on the transition monitor side. And also we have been developing a standalone desktop solution that is targeted at banks wishing to stress test their loan portfolio. Can we go to the first slide, please? Right. So firstly, let's take a step back and look into what stress testing is about. The idea of stress testing really took off actually after the great financial crisis, after the last large crisis that the banks have experienced. And what we did, or what we're trying to do, is to take financial scenarios that are, let's say, 1 to 3 years in length and test the resilience of the financial institution to a specific type of crisis. And we do that by imagining a baseline scenario, which is, let's say, the less benign scenario, and more of a adverse scenario. And the difference between these scenarios would be the crisis that the institution is experiencing and the associated risks that the institutions will have during this crisis. The traditional stress tests rely mainly on historical data and some kind of real economic forecasts of the economy. They are, as I said, fairly short-term in nature. And this is where, when we start to think about new type of risks, like the climate risk, this is where we sort of hit the wall, where we struggle. Because since you may imagine, climate risks, as for example, physical risk or transition risk, they can be fairly long to have the consequences in. We can talk about 10, 15, 20 years periods. So for climate stress testing, we have to take into account long-term horizons. We have to take into account 20-year, 15, 20-year scenarios. And this is what is really different about stress tests that focus on climate and on the traditional stress tests. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, we can skip this one as I already explained it. Maybe the next one. Yes. So as you can see here, in a climate stress test, we're looking at multiple scenarios, not only baseline or adverse scenario, but any type of scenario that we can imagine. The idea is that climate transition and towards the green economy involves a lot of contingencies, a lot of risks. We don't know what the governments will do yet fully. We don't know how much of a impact the firms will take in. So that's why we have to imagine multiple type of scenarios. For us to imagine these multiple scenarios that are long, we have to take into account forward-looking data. Can we go to the next slide, please? The forward-looking data will help us establish how many scenarios a financial institution can possibly have struggle with. It's not about us being able to really estimate in which scenarios the institution will fail, but to how many possible futures the institution might have problems with. Also, one thing to remember is that we're not trying to forecast the futures. We're trying to imagine all possible futures that are probable given the current state of the world, given the current policies that the government are implementing. But we're not trying to make point estimates. This would be a really wrong idea to do in a stress testing. Key thing to remember here is that due to the nature of the fact that this is a more, let's say, uncertain type of modeling, we're unable to fully validate these models. These are not traditional risk models in the sense of the previous credit risk or market risk models. These are models that help us sort of figure out all the possible ways we can struggle with. We're not trying to estimate the exact costs that a financial institution might have, but we're trying to estimate all the possible futures where the financial institutions might have significant costs. These type of stress tests are already being performed by some central banks. The ECB has recently published its first climate stress test. The Bank of England, Banque de France, have already done a similar thing. And these type of stress tests focus mainly on transition risk. Transition risk is the type of risk that is associated with the transition of the economy towards a new green status quo. We're not trying to estimate the costs associated with extreme weather events or with the increase of the world temperature yet, because this is fairly data heavy and we're still fairly new in this area, but we are working on it. But what I would like to stress is that all of the climate stress tests to date that have been published and the one that we are working in are focusing on transition. Next slide, please. So since we're dealing with new types of risks and new types of horizons, we have to sort of change and tweak the research question. The idea is that we're trying to look into what would happen to a financial institution given some kind of a transition shock. This is done by using the Pacta Methodology or some of the Pacta Methodology. And what we're doing is that we look into the production pathways of the companies that the bank or the investor have on their portfolio. We look on the technology mix that these companies have and the associated production of each of this technology. Given this technology is, for example, let's say a green technology or brown technology, we can say how much of a transition impact this technology will have when there is, when we imagine a sort of a shock year or a point of transition. what we're looking at is not at which firms we're rather looking at which firms will profit from the necessary transition and which firms will fail. This data that we get then is translated into the planned and future prices, costs, and profit margins of those firms that hold these technologies. And since we have these future profits, we can then calculate, let's say, do a future valuation of these firms, and then take in this data, this valuation data, into the portfolios of both the investor and the bank, and calculate the market risk associated with it and the credit risk for banks. Next slide, please. So the key idea is that, and I think this needs to be really stressed, and this is what we take in from Pacta, is we take in forward-looking production data. How do we do that? So this is fairly massive undertaking in terms of business intelligence, but we do have a large amount of production plans of large industrial companies. These will be 5-year ahead production plans. And these are segregated to different technologies. So let's say a firm that is an oil major, an oil producing firm, and that plans to keep investing in oil fields, will have certain technology pathway, production pathway 5 years ahead that shows that they will keep investing in oil. And there is another firm that, for example, is also an oil producer, but plans to transition to a business model that is based on solar farms. So for this firm, we'll see an increase in production for solar farms and a decrease in their oil capacity. The key point here is that both these technologies and all of the technologies that we take into account, we only look at the impact these technologies have on carbon emissions. I understand that this is not the full picture of climate change, but since we're mainly focusing on impact and carbon emissions is the most impactful factor in global warming, this is what we look at. These are only technologies that we focus on that are heavy in carbon emissions. Next slide, please. So in the previous example, I think I tried to explain that what this model is trying to do is to differentiate climate laggards from those who are planning to invest into green transition. This means that high carbon technologies under a transition scenario will have to decrease production, while low carbon technologies will increase production, and this will then translate into the associated prices and costs and profits for each of these technologies. When we do our scenario analysis, we look at multiple scenarios, and we look at some kind of a target baseline scenario, which here is the SDS scenario used by the International Energy Association. And this is the scenario, the ideal world, let's say, the transition that all the companies need to achieve. We look at where the company stands today, given this target scenario. And this would be, let's say, if we talk about a company that is a more high carbon company, this company would be sort of above this scenario. It would be producing more than it should in this technology. And this area above the scenario is the area A1 that you can see on the plot on the right. And this is the misalignment of this technology and this company towards the target scenario. Then when we get to a shock year, which we can then tweak within this is one of the input parameters in our model, we get to a transition. And in a transition, what happens is that this firm will then have to decrease and get closer to this target scenario. What we're trying to do here is to internalize the cost associated with the transition that this firm will have to undertake towards this scenario, and these costs will then have to overcompensate the previous misalignment of the company. So what happens in the modeling situation is that the area A2 will then have to be equal to the area A1, and this area A2 will involve, and this will basically calculate all the transition costs, carbon tax, let's say, or policy risk that this firm will have to undertake given a transition. Next slide, please. When we get this overcompensation and these costs, transition costs associated with the necessary transition, we can then take these and plug them into a discounted future cash flow model, which will give us the future profits of this firm, and which we can then use to evaluate and forecast the equity value of the firm under transition. The idea for using this is that the equity value that we get in the future and the equity value that we get under a sort of a baseline scenario, an ideal target scenario, the difference between them will give us the market risk associated with a transition. And also we can use this technology to, we can use this calculation to plug it into a PD model, a credit risk model. And for banks, if we talk about loans to counterparties, we can use the future valuation to calculate the PD changes, the probability of default of these companies. Next slide, please. So as I said, the transition risk for the market risk is associated with the equity change, and here you can see the sort of expected equity changes that we have. You can clearly see that the highest the biggest negative equity change is associated with oil or gas, so sort of with the brown technologies, whereas something like nuclear power or renewables experience an increase in equity value. ICE is internal combustion engines. Next slide. And so, as I explained before, we can also use the same idea and plug it into a credit risk model. This is a very theoretical model in its nature, and we are working on improving it. But what this model already is giving us is fairly good sense of the direction of PD changes given a specific firm, technology, and sector. And we can already see that the probability of default for high carbon technologies is a lot higher, is getting worse with climate transition. And what's more interesting, the later the firm transitions, so we can say the later we plan the shock year, the transition year, the higher the costs are associated. So we can already see that the firms that plan to transition now and in time can actually avoid both the increased probability of default, but also the worsened equity changes. Next slide, please. So this is just a theoretical image of the Merton model, and the Merton model takes in the equity value, the debt, and the volatility of assets of a firm. And when we use this, using this within our framework, we can then clearly see that the firms which are high carbon have higher PD changes, and this increases in the shock year. You can see it on in the slide on the right, when we take into account a later shock year, which is the one at the bottom, shock year 2035. You can see that, for example, a coal sector firm is much more likely to have a higher PD than if it had transitioned in 2025. But what I would like to stress here is this is a fairly new idea, new research framework. And we are continually developing it. We've only recently published this solution to online. This is an open source, so you can already use this. However, we're still road testing the solution. There is one Malaysian bank that we've been testing it with already, and we plan to gradually improve it, extend this framework, make it more user-friendly as well, and possibly as user-friendly as Pacta. But this will take another couple months, and maybe within the space of this year or second half of this year, we can then publish a more user-friendly solution that is available to the general public. But for those investors around you who wish to use Pacta Interactive Report, you can already use part of our stress test framework within the interactive report. And for banks, you can already also download a source code from our webpage. However, this requires some previous knowledge of our coding and stress testing. So we might have to keep working on that and make it maybe more approachable in the future. But yeah, this is a very exciting topic that 2DI is taking an initiative on, a very new research idea. And yeah, we're looking forward to working with as many of you on improving our model and implementing our solution.
Great, thank you so much, Jacob, for that. I know there was quite a lot of details in all of this, so please feel free to reach out to us afterwards with any kind of questions. We do have a dedicated Q&A session after the next segment of this presentation. I firstly just want to check, Alberto, do we have you on the call? You could unmute and just confirm.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Hi, amazing. Thanks so much, Alberto. In that case, I will stop sharing and then I will hand over to Alberto Govasini from ING, who is the lead of the terror report. As I mentioned before, ING have been very supportive and also contributed to the methodological development of Pacta. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Alberto, and if you would like to start sharing slides, you can take it from there. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Actually, George, could you maybe help me with sharing the slides because I'm having some technical issues here?
Absolutely. Give me 2 minutes to get them up.
Or let me try again. Thank you, George. In the meantime, maybe I can give a quick introduction of myself and start kicking off the presentation. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Alberto Gervasini. I work in ING in the Global Sustainability Department, and I'm the lead for the Terra initiative, which is ING's approach to steer the lending book towards our climate targets, and more specifically, in this case, we are talking about getting to net zero by 2050. As George has mentioned, we are Pacta users, so yeah, I'm happy to guide you through that today, so that you can also have a taste of how it looks like, how it will look like if your bank will start using Pacta, how you can measure your the climate impact of your portfolio, and how you can eventually steer on that. We can go to the next slide, George. And just to give you a bit of context, I'll quickly go through ING's strategy. So what are we talking about today? We have a integrated climate strategy in ING. We want to steer our portfolio, empower our clients and businesses, to reach net zero by 2050 or sooner. And there are 4 main objectives. The first one is to reach net zero in our own operation. Second one is to steer our portfolio towards net zero by 2050 or sooner. And as you can see there, Terra approach is mentioned. And this is what we are going to talk about today. Then there is financing and advising clients in line with a net zero economy and managing climate and environmental risks for both ING of our clients. And George and other colleagues from TDI mentioned a few things about climate risk and mitigation, adaptation, stress testing. That's not going to be part of our presentation. What we're going to focus is the circle option, so steering really the lending book of our bank. So you can move to the next slide. So what is Terra about? Terra is, as we've mentioned, steering our loan book, our full lending book towards net zero by 2050. And it's based on three key principles. It is, first of all, impact-based, it is science-based, and engagement-driven. Impact-based means that we are focusing on the sectors that are mostly responsible for GHG emissions in the world. You can see that there is this pie chart in the bottom left, which shows where the emissions are coming from at the global level, and we have hence focused on 9 of the sectors that are mainly responsible for the emissions. There is one missing, which is agriculture, which simply, it's simply because there is no methodology available yet today to actually measure and steer the portfolio towards climate goals, but we'll adopt that as soon as possible, as soon as there is a new one. It is science-based, meaning we use apply science-based scenario. We want to use great data as granular as possible, physical asset level data, and then we apply what we call a toolbox approach, which means that for each sector we apply a specific methodology. And third pillar is, again, engagement-driven, meaning that we don't just want to divest from certain clients or sectors, but we want to support our clients in the transition and help them with our tools to transition to a greener way of doing business. Now, these principles are basically what links us to Pacta, having a methodology specific per each sector, the use of very granular data, as much as possible, the application of science-based scenarios. So that is, I would say, the first reason why we chose Pacta. And we can move to the next slide, George. Me to clarify why we have chosen to follow a sector-specific approach is that different things need to happen in each sector. When you think about power and oil and gas, we need to increase renewables financing, moving away from coal, and decreasing over time the use of oil and gas. When you think about automotive, there needs to be a shift from combustion engine vehicles to battery electric vehicles, and in aviation and in shipping, there needs to be a limitation of CO2 emissions through updating, renewing the fleets, retrofitting, operational efficiency, using biofuels. So it is clear that one single methodology for every single sector wouldn't work. There needs to be something which is tailored per sector, depending on what needs to happen in each sector. We can move to the next slide, George. So at a high level, here is a summary of the methodologies that we use. As you can see, for most of our sectors, namely power, cement, steel, automotive, and aviation, we use the Pacta methodology. We use some other methodologies for specific sectors. For example, in shipping, you may be familiar with the Poseidon principles, which we have adopted. And for oil and gas as well, we use, it's not officially a Pacta specific methodology, but we do use a methodology that has been co-developed with TDI and the Katowice banks. As you can see also from the primary output column, the metrics that we use are different per sector. So for example, for power and automotive, we use the technology mix. So we are looking at what kind of technology our clients are using. So, for example, how they are producing energy, or what kind of cars they are producing. For cement and steel, we use a bit of a different approach. We look at the emissions coming per unit of production of ton of steel, for example, or ton of cement. And in aviation, we look at the CO2 coming out of, planes, of course, per kilogram, per passenger kilometer. And we basically translate all these primary output eventually in reporting metrics, which are eventually always CO2 intensity. To make it a bit more concrete and to show you how the results eventually look like, George, you can skip the next slide and go and move on by 2. Yes, thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, we apply different methodologies. We cover about 9 sectors at the moment, and I just wanted to give you a snapshot of how eventually the results look like, since we have done already quite some talking about the methodologies. So here you see for each sector is a lot of downward sloping lines, which basically represent what we need to do, the decrease of in CO2 or CO2 emission intensity that we need to follow in the coming years. And then you see also some indicators, green, amber, red, to show if our progress is in line with what we would like to see or not. Now, I'd like to go to the next slide, George, to give you a bit of better understanding of what we are looking at. So this is a zoom in for the power generation. All the sectors are a bit different, but here's maybe a clear example of what we, how we report and what we show externally to our stakeholders. So here for power generation, we are showing the emission intensity of our portfolio. So you can see that on the graph. On the horizontal axis, there's time from 2018 to 2040. And on the vertical axis, you can see our metric, which is an emission intensity based metric, which is kilograms of CO2 equivalents produced per megawatt hour being produced. So how do the results look like? You can see, I'll get you through all the items in the graph now, starting with the orange dots. You see that's the ING lending portfolio, so our emission intensity. And you can compare it with the global market average portfolio, which is represented by the purple dots. And then the other very first important point to look at is the ING target. You see that blue dot in 2040. And then you see the convergence pathway, which is basically a straight line from where we were in 2018 and where we are, where we want to be in 2040. So we know that we need to steer our portfolio towards a direction, and we compare on a yearly basis with our convergence pathway. Additionally, there's a few more lines into this graph which represent the scenario we benchmark with. So you can see, for example, there is the gray line, which is the SDS global scenario, the well below 2 degrees scenario. And then the same scenario is actually represented by the light blue line as well. We have included that light blue line as well, but that's actually the OECD scenario only. It's not the global scenario. And we have included that to benchmark ourselves with, because our bank is mainly active in OECD countries. So it makes more sense for us to be benchmarking against such scenario rather than the global one. And eventually there's also the net zero scenario, which is a global one. For now, it's the only one available, as published by the International Energy Agency. And it's actually where our target is in 2040. So by applying Pacta, this is actually the results that you can have. And there's actually more information to that. There's something that we don't show here, and more specifically, the forecasts. George has already mentioned that, but we do have data available for our portfolio and actually for the market as well, up to 2025. So we know how our portfolio will look like in 2025 already, if we should keep our portfolio stable as it currently is. So same clients, same exposures. George, we can go to the next slide. Yes, so eventually how can we actually steer? We always we do so still by using the data that is provided us with by 2DI, and of course still using Pacta. With that data, we do have client information available, so we were able to build tools like dashboards to know exactly where each of our clients are, and actually to know where prospects are as well. And that helps us with engagement with our own clients. So for example, here you see an example for automotive, which shows combustion engine vehicles capacity and electric vehicle and hybrid capacity. So we do have that breakdown for each company, and that helps us with engaging with our clients to see if they are transitioning fast enough to be in line with net zero, or in general our climate target, but also if they're transitioning faster or slower than the competition, and then we can support them with our products to move towards a greener way of doing business and reaching climate goals. As I've mentioned earlier, the key one of the key pillars for us, for ING, and for Pacta as well, is actually to engage with clients. So that's what we want to do, and see how our clients can improve and offer them solutions to improve. We can move to the next slide, George. So this is a quick recap, let's say, of why did we choose Pacta. I've mentioned it's that Pacta offers current and forward-looking data. The data that is provided with can be both at company level or asset level. And for example, for steel or cement manufacturers, we do have information not only at company level, but at really factory level. So we know where the factories are of our clients, where they do operate, and how efficient are they in terms of emission intensity. So that gives us the opportunity to better engage with our clients. Once again, it's engagement driven and sets the right incentives to move forward to a better future. And Pacta does not simply rely on marginal gains on efficiency, but really looks at what needs to happen in each sector. So for example, again, automotive, it looks at the shift from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, rather than having marginal gains on combustion engine vehicles. So these features are very, very important for us, and are one of the biggest reasons of why we use Pacta. Eventually, it's also scenario and data agnostic, meaning you can use your own climate goals, whether those are 1.5, well below 2 degrees, or even more ambitious or less ambitious. And you can use, again, your own data 2DI does provide you with that, but if you are able to collect the data yourself, you can also do so. We can move to the next slide, George. Yes, one of the last few pieces of information I'd like to share with you. George, I think, already shared some information about the Pacta methodology and the publication that was done by 2 Degrees Investing Initiative and the Pacta team. But I would also like to highlight that there is another paper that you could look at if you're interested in adopting Pacta, which is the application to the Pacta methodology, which we co-developed with a few other banks, namely BBVA, Standard Chartered, Société Générale, and BNP, and 2DI, of course, to give more guidance on how we have adopted the Pacta methodology and how we are using it to steer our portfolio. Lastly, there is still one more slide I'd like to share with you, and we can go to it, George. This is one of the questions that we receive the most, so I thought about including one more slide. We have been talking about Pacta and its benefits, but we always, almost always, receive the question, why not an overarching methodology like based on absolute emissions? And there is the answer is we use both methodologies. Actually, we use absolute emissions based methodologies to identify the hotspots in our loan book, to understand which are the sectors, hence, that are mostly responsible for the GHG emissions coming out of our lending book, and to understand which sectors we should be covering. But then there are a few limitations of GHG accounting metrics and methodologies. And so while they are very useful to compare different sectors, understand where your hotspots are, they are not very useful in terms of, or at least we don't find them very useful in terms of steering, or because of a number of reasons, including having a weaker link to what needs to happen in the real economy, and no link to specific technology roadmaps, for example, the International Agency one. And this is why we use sector-specific intensity metric that are not applied to the full loan book, but do cover the vast majority of the Scope 3 emissions that are related to our lending book. And this is, again, one of the other main reasons that we use Pacta for. So I will pause here and give George again, yes, the word, and I'm happy to stay here for a bit longer for any Q&A that may pop up.
Great, thank you so much, Alberto, for taking time and for such great presentation. We have roughly 20 minutes left, so we'll open the floor up for questions. But just quickly before we do that, I again want to extend our gratitude to UK Pact Malaysia Working Stream for funding this project. Also to our implementation partners, WWF Malaysia, to Fatin, who you heard from earlier, and her team as well. A big thank you, Alberto, for joining us today and providing this insight to how you use Pacta, and of course the extensions, well, and in addition to that, your terror report as well. Again, to JC3 for hosting, and to the MSFI for their support. Finally, just a big thank you to everyone that's participating. As Martin said at the beginning, it's really inspiring to see so many participants. And I hope that some of you will join us for our session tomorrow. So the session tomorrow will be at the same time. You should have invite links. If not, please drop us a message and we can share them again. And just quickly on the agenda for tomorrow, we'll kick things off with a presentation of an upcoming white paper that we have co-drafted with a group of Malaysian banks, also WWF Malaysia. And we'll be going through some high-level takeaways that we found and also some recommendations for Malaysian financial institutions, specifically banks, if they're going to be implementing Pacta themselves as well. After that, we'll then introduce some of 2DII's additional work streams. So there'll be a 15-minute presentation on our retail investor work stream, which is focused around preventing greenwashing in this space. So mapping the sustainability desires and goals of your clients to the products the products that investors are offering through the securities. Then we also have a work stream on impact. So this is getting to the notion of how a financial institution communicates on the impact that they are having on the real economy. So that will have another quick 15 minutes. And then finally, we'll have a quick presentation from our 1 in 1,000 work stream, who are concerned with long-term risk. In fact, you've already heard from our stress testing team who fall into that element, that work stream of ours. And also this is relevant to kind of supervisory and long-term risks. So with that, I would like to introduce Daisy, who's going to take us through some of the questions you've been asking. I would ask to start with Alberto's questions, and also for all of the other panelists to come back online so that we can go through some of these great questions. Thanks, Daisy. Over to you.
Thanks, George, and thanks, Alberto, and also Naira and Martin for the participation today. I guess, yes, we will start with two questions that are actually very related to one specific topic, and it's about engagement. So it is a question for you, Alberto, from two of the participants. They are interested for you to say a few words on your experience about the engagement with clients using the Pacta tool, like specific, like what is your say on, or how did you go with the engagement of clients that are actually not in line with the targets? What's their feedback? How is their capacity and their motivation? If you can say some few words about it.
Sure, happy to do so. Well, actually, our story usually resonates with the clients. So, of course, they are very much aware of the climate crisis as well, and many of our clients are already adopting measures to improve their climate footprinting, to reduce the impact that they have on climate. And of course, so in general, our story resonates very well with them. And for some of them, it's usually a way to exchange insights and see what can the bank do for that specific company. For other companies that maybe are less advanced, well, usually the conversation is more about us sharing insights of what we have, what we think they could do. Now, for example, looking at the aviation space, we use metrics that incentivize operational excellence, so that less trips are done for the same amount of passengers, basically. So and that there's a number of other things that you can look at, retrofitting and configuration of the airplanes. So there's a number of things that we can engage on with our clients and either provide them with just these insights and support, and sometimes that also leads, of course, to additional business and we financing maybe some of the additional measures that they would like to take to improve their current situation.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Please say so. I think it's Lilian and Jonas. But in the meantime, we have another question for ING also. How do they monitor their financing portfolio for energy usage?
Yes. So for our power generation portfolio, we do track. Well, we do use Pacta. There, in terms of energy use, if I'm correct, we look at first of all the capacity. So it's capacity based. We know where, as from the International Energy Agency, we know where we need to be, where the world needs to be in terms of capacity generation in the coming years, and that's how we track it. So we have maybe more specifically two ways of tracking the power generation coming from our clients, and these two ways are either at company level or asset level. So for project financing, we know exactly, of course, what kind of project it is, and for example, if it's a say wind power plant, we know exactly what is the capacity of that power plant, and then we say it's relatively easy to measure. Maybe it's less intuitive to measure when we give general purpose loans to companies that are active in the power generation space, and in that case we do calculate that the money that goes to that company for general purposes is basically attributed to a pro rata on the capacity of that overall company, which is of course less accurate, but that's the best way that we have to attribute general purpose loans to our power generation portfolio.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alberto. I think there were not a lot of questions related to specifically to ING, but we have some questions remaining from the very beginning of the webinar, and those were related to the sectoral scope of Pacta. So George, if you can say a few words. There were some questions specifically related to some sectors that are out of the scope, for example, agriculture, real estate. Some of the participants were asking like how to measure the alignment of these sectors and why these are not included in Pacta.
Great, thanks a lot, Daisy. So I think you pull up the most two noticeable sectors that are currently out of scope. The first one is agriculture, and the second one being real estate. The reason that they're not included to date is that we don't have, as Pacta is a scenario alignment methodology, and as the core tenets of this prescribes us to use asset level bottom-up production data to which we can forecast forward-looking 5 years and compare that to production trends in scenarios, we don't have these for the agricultural sector. If you think what that would, for in the power sector, we have megawatts of coal versus megawatts of renewables and how that changes. We don't have the same kind of comparison for agriculture as of yet. So we don't know that we have to build out, I don't know, wheat at this rate of change compared to soybeans at this rate of change. And we don't have asset level data to be able to map that to. That does not mean to say that this isn't a hugely important topic to cover. Of course it is, and I very much think in the Malaysian context it's hugely important as well. We are actively pursuing options to include it. Pacta is an iterative methodology, so it's always getting added to. That brings me on to real estate. I know ING have done a lot of work on real estate. We've included it with some of our work in a Swiss project as well. And it is very much on the list for this year to include real estate. So yeah, it's not to say we don't think it's important. We very much do. It's more, does that methodology fit that sector? To date, we can't find a link for agriculture, but we're actively pursuing it. And real estate, we're very much, it's in the pipeline. So yeah, I hope that covers that. And also to say there's no silver bullet to this. There's many different methodologies that can be used in a collaborative manner to give a complete picture of your alignment and also your risk. And I think the ING approach is testament to that as well. Cool, I hope that answers the question. I think whilst I was here, sorry, there was a question around digitalization of the bank's activities. My quick take on this is, if I've understood the question correctly, is this is more relevant to kind of current accounts with individuals that a bank might hold and how that is